All right, welcome everybody to Constraints. We've got a lot to cover. I'm very excited for this class because I think this is going to be one of those. It's like, oh, that's how that works. That's cool. And if it's not functioning for me right now, what else do I do? Because there are a couple of different ways you can go about doing what we're going to do today. I'm going to show you several options. I'm going to try to break down a bunch of different stuff for you. So let's just dive right into it. So let me move this over here so you can see. Okay. Now, for anybody who is experienced with animation and has spent some time doing constraints, I just want to lead off by acknowledging that it's everybody's favorite thing, constraints. We all love that technical stuff, especially in Maya. I just know how much you love it. Unfortunately for everybody here, you're not going to spend that much time setting up constraints in Unreal because it's just a lot easier. For everyone who's not an animator, just to let you know, constraints in Maya historically have been kind of awful. They work fine. You just have to know how kind of under the hood it's setting things up. There's a lot of hidden checkboxes, and they've never been the most fun process. But luckily, the team at Epic has been doing a lot to make that process a lot easier. And so it's not that bad in Unreal, unless something breaks. Sometimes things don't work, but it's a new tool. And so as soon as it's not a new tool, it'll be even better. But to dive into it, what are constraints? What are we even talking about in today's class? Basically, we're going to go over different ways to attach stuff to your characters, or different way to attach your characters to other stuff. Any kind of attachment in your scene, that is pretty much the topic of today. And then just to go over, we do have, there is a project file download available to you. You do not need to follow along in this class. I don't expect you to follow along. In fact, I'd probably prefer that for the most part, if you're new to this especially, watch, take notes, come up with questions, and then we'll dive into some specific questions and hands-on stuff in the live lab or in the course lab. And so I have some examples that we'll do together later, but just a heads up, some of the stuff that I'm doing will be in the downloads. So we're going to cover a couple different ways to connect objects to characters. We're going to do regular animation constraints. We're going to do, which is the main topic of the day. But Unreal has a few other options. We're going to talk about sockets and attach tracks, which are a sequencer device that's going to be really helpful. It might make more sense depending on your needs. And then there's snapping and space switching, which we'll also talk about, which is super cool. We are going to be using some weapon props just to point out where I got those. They're from the Lyra project, which is free. It's one of the Epic Games content packs. It's like a whole starter game thing. And so if you like the rifle and stuff that I'm using, that's where I got them. Everything else, though, is the same assets we've been using up to this point. All right, so to give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover, I'm going to start off with sockets and attach tracks, which is, we're going to call that level 1. It's going to be the easier method, or not only easier, it's the simpler method, but not always quite as flexible. We're going to dive into constraints a little bit after that, after a break, and then we're going to dive into space switching and some additional tools at the end. So that's our order of events. Beginning us off, let's dive into attach tracks and sockets. So everything that I'm about to show you is in this document. Everything, the slides have some documentation for you, so you should be able to refer back to it if you get lost. But it's fairly easy. Oh, hopefully it's straightforward at least. Attached tracks are basically something inside of Sequencer in the same way that you can have a track for animation, you can have a track for your transform, you can have tracks for various things in Sequencer all inside here. We can also create tracks called attached tracks where you are telling Unreal Sequencer, hey, like connect these two things for this period of time. And so I'll give you a layer bar track. And you can still do stuff independently. It's kind of like just parenting something temporarily. You still have the ability to animate both objects independently, and it will change the parenting hierarchy, which is the thing about this that makes it kind of weird. Let's dive right into the engine, and I will show you how this works. So here we are. I am going to just make a new level sequence, and we're going to call this class time. All right. If I take a cube, and we're going to use that as our object that our character is going to grab. I'm going to take a control rig. We'll use the mannequin for today. They're a little bit more stable in my experience for these demos. There's Manny. I don't know why that's all the way over there, so I'm just going to say ignore that, make a new one. Shapes cube. There we go. So if I want to create an attach track, bring my objects into the sequencer as usual, and all you have to do is when you're dealing with this type of stuff, you always want to grab the child object, the child actor. So in this case, we'll take the cube and we'll say, hey, you're the thing we want to follow the mannequin. So select the cube, go to track, and you say, I would like to attach with a new binding to something, or you can existing binding. So this is the process of finding it. You say, oh, object, add track, attach track. And then in here, we have various options that I'm going to go over in just a second. Yes. And so actually, I do want to talk about that really quick before I actually hit the buttons. Oh, and last thing I didn't really point out, to give this a minute to breathe, you can have multiple attach tracks active on an object, but I don't really recommend it for an animation workflow. We'll come back to this, but I just want to sort of call that out right now. This is that menu I was just pulling up. So what this will do, as soon as I go through and hit the buttons and create an attach track, it's going to create a temporary parent relationship, and not a parent constraint, but it's going to parent the object in the hierarchy to the other thing, to the other actor. And so the only thing I wanted to point out is that if I just hit attach, it will do so, but it will usually snap to another location. It'll snap to whatever its world space is then relative to the object it's parented to, so it'll jump. And so if you don't want that to happen, which you typically don't, so just heads up, you're going to want to hit this little button here that says preserve current, and it'll create a compensation keyframe, which we've seen before. So back over here, if I take my cube, go to track, say attach, and I change this first to say preserve current, that will allow me to just say attach to Manny, and it'll ask, what do you want to attach it to? Because you can attach it to any bone on Manny. And so if I just say hand, I can go to hand right, for example. You can see that there's an interesting like little line that gets created. All of that has to do with the compensation keyframe. So that's just keying stuff in space to keep it in place. But just know that has made things work nicely for us. So I should be able to just scrub through here. And you can see that stuff kind of pops. See how the keyframe data for this object kind of changes location, changes spaces. That was that preserve current. So it does that, and now it's following him. So now if I come over from frame 15 to the key here, move the arm, we're good to go. Actually, that is in the wrong space, but that's okay. Switch that. There you go. So that's one way to just attach something, and we're going to keep going and talk about what to do with that. So to get that to stop being connected, you can absolutely disconnect it. This is the thing. So this is where we start to diverge a bit from Maya. If you are familiar with Maya, you can't create a parenting relationship with an object and then ever disconnect it. So if you want to have a character grab their mug and take a drink and then put it down, you have to do a constraint, because you have to be able to turn on the constraint, have them act with the object, and then turn off the constraint to have them disconnect from it. If you just parent something in Maya or most traditional software, that is a permanent relationship. You can't do anything about it. It's just parented. And so people will use tricks like trying to toggle up, having two mugs, one's invisible and you swap visibilities. We're not going to do any of that. With an attached track, you do have the ability to toggle that parent relationship, which is interesting and different. And so if we want to detach these objects from each other and then continue animating them separately, we can, and we'll show you how to do it. It's really just a right-click menu. There are a couple ways that you might think that, like, oh, I'll just go and I'll manually key it, or I'll go find the checkbox and uncheck it. Like, I wouldn't recommend it. Use this menu. This is like the way to do it. You'll find a couple of YouTube tutorials that suggest other methods. They will not work as well as this. So I'll just show you. So if I say, I've got this cube, and then he raises it up with the force, and then he's going to disconnect from it. What you want to do is you want to find your attach track, and there are handles on the edges. So you can technically shave it down and pull it, and that's one of the methods where you might think, oh, I'll just collapse it down. It's not going to work great because it doesn't do the compensation keyframes. It needs that kind of space switching thing. It needs that operation. It needs to know where it's going to live. So if I right click on the attach track itself, that's where you have you can make more attach tracks or change it. But you can say trim right and preserve or trim left and preserve. So trim right and preserve will chop everything off to the right and say stop being connected and preserve the current location. So if I hit that, it will do it. Now, a little bit of a gotcha. It's going to work, but it's not going to look like it works. Right? Why, oh, why is it flying away? I didn't do that. That was a new cube. I definitely didn't set that keyframe. It actually worked just fine. When it first created the attach track, it created a compensation keyframe at the beginning, and it created a location keyframe at the very end to hold it in place. And so there's actually just another keyframe right over here floating around. So if I looked at my graph editor or my curve editor, you'll see that, I don't know why this is so big, something with my resolution, but you can see that there's just a keyframe all the way over here, and that's why it's floating away. So once you disconnect it, just delete that keyframe off in the distance on the transform of the cube, and we're fine. So you can see the object lives over here. I can do whatever I want with it. Here, it's floating around with the hand, then it disconnects, and then I can now take that hand and animate it, and you can see they're no longer attached to each other. And I never really pointed it out, but I absolutely have the ability to animate this cube separately, both within the transformation and outside of it. The only difference is I already had some transform keyframes, so it now might behave a little bit weird. But I can still just go into my curves and mess with it and, whatever. Switch these to auto, make it a little bit smoother. So I can still do whatever I need to do with that cube. So this works great. And a lot of people might think, oh, so why do we need to worry about constraints? Why even have another option? That seems like it works fairly well. Well, the main reason is if I select this cube, let me go over to my outliner. So if I take a look at my outliner, not my animation outliner, but my regular outliner, if I select this cube, notice where it is in the outliner. See, it's just like floating over here. Cube in class time, cool. Watch where it goes as I drag the playhead. See that? As soon as I go into the attach track, this is what I meant by it's a temporary parent relationship. It actually changes its hierarchy in my scene to be parented to the actor above it, to the mannequin here. And that might not be an issue for you, but that also might completely rule this out as an option for what you're doing. Like if you're using different actors or different skeletal setups and different things, that just might be like, oh, okay, well, that's not an option then. Can't do that. Can't change the hierarchy. But if it works, hey, there's a choice for you. Now, there is one more thing that I want to dive into before we move to other sort of topics with this, and that's sockets. So with an attached track, when you create this relationship of, hey, like follow this object, do what it does. When I created the cube attached track, which by the way, if I wanted to delete it, I can just hit attach and delete it. And it's going to kind of break things a little bit. You'll notice that my cube pops away, and that's because it had compensation keyframes, and now they're still there. So when it does this, where'd it go? It is like way over here. The keyframes that the cube had on it are still there, but now they're not as relevant because it's not doing that hierarchy change. And so if you end up doing this out of order, then I'm going to have to come in here and probably delete my transformation data. I could have kept the rotation data and preserved some of my work, but in this case, it's a demo, so it's fine. But I want to also throw out the caveat that whatever you're doing with constraints, attach tracks, all that kind of stuff, before you start, I recommend saving your sequence and maybe making a copy of it. So whatever you're doing with your level sequence, just right-click, duplicate, and just say version 2, which hopefully you're doing anyways. But you'll see this is it's a good practice because if you do something wrong or you end up having to like undo your work or delete stuff, undoing in some of these processes Unreal doesn't always like when you undo certain things here. Keyframes can get funky. I wouldn't want you to lose any work and be like, oh no, now I have to do 8 steps to try and get back to where I was before I hit the button. So it's always a good idea just to make a quick backup copy. But I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just get in the habit of doing that in general. It's good to version your work. Anyway, so if I delete the cube attach track, it's just a cube again doing its thing. And if I want to show you the socket thing, if I go to cube and I say attach track back to Manny, or I could say new binding, and I could just pick any actor in the scene. I'll just do Manny from here, same thing. You can see that it picks all these different bones. By default, it just grabs the whole skeleton. Now, if you have a specific spot that you're trying to put it to, great. Like if you're trying to put it on the hand, there's a hand bone. If you're trying to put it on the clavicle, you'll find it. But what if you are trying to put it somewhere that does not have a specific spot? And also, if you're not doing that preserve current, right? Because that was the other thing. If I show you here, if I go to attach and I turn the preserve off, I say, no, don't preserve it. I want it to snap to that spot. I actually want to change how this model looks. I want to give him a hat. I want to give him a wonderful cube hat. I could go to track, attach, and then we could say, go to Manny. And we go to his head and say, whoa, let's pick his head. And then, let me double check here. That's not quite where I thought it would go. I think if I go to my details, yeah, there you go. If I zero out the location, that's it. So if I zero out the location of the cube, it snaps to his head. Let me scale it down there, and I can show you it doesn't really go where I want it to go. That's not exactly like the spot I'd want to constrain it to for his head. I was hoping it'd be like at the crown of his head. Now, of course, I can go and make adjustments, but if I were going to be doing this lots, I don't know. Sockets are a good example here of like, sometimes you want to make your own custom spot. So let me show you how to do that. You can modify any skeleton to have additional sockets, and you can use them for attach tracks and things like this. Or if you are going to put a hat on your character and things like that, you usually will want to have a spot to say, oh, hat, go here, go on the little thing on the head or whatever. So let me show you how to make that work. If you take your mannequin, actually, I'm getting carried away and going through let me just show you everything. Let me go back to the slide that talks about sockets for a second. What is a socket? A socket is like a locator. It's going to be an empty bone within the hierarchy. And so that's what's going to allow us to pick it within the skeleton group and do different things with it. And so this is the slide that now says, hey, hello, we have sockets. So let's go ahead, now that you've had a minute to look at that, back to Unreal. If we select, oh, and Franco brings up a really good point. Yes, don't use constraint to attach tracks between possessable and spawnable objects. Let them both be the same, like have them both be possessable or they both be spawnable, because it's a little weird. Yes, very good point. I want to make sure that's in the recording. So if I go to my over here to Manny, I'll use Quinn. Well, I guess they're both same skeleton. If I go to mannequin, if I go to Manny, if I double click on him, it pulls up his skeletal mesh editor. And over here on the left, this is so weird. My screen resolution is a little bit big. Everything's large. I guess you can read it better. Over here on the left, you've got all the different bones in the character. Now, right off the bat, one thing you might want, if you're going to make sockets, it might be helpful to actually see the skeleton. And so I'm going to go over to character, bones. I'm going to say all hierarchy, and that's going to allow me to actually see the entire skeleton. And I can select things, and I can navigate a little bit easier. You can also go into bones, and you can turn on sockets, which is probably helpful. And so if there are sockets, you'll be able to see them. Come back to. So anyway, so if I'm doing the thing with the hat, I'm going to just go in the skeleton tree and search for head. That's going to make my life a little bit easier to say, there's the head. Cool, that'll help me navigate, scroll, and hit F, whatever it is. Oops, F there doesn't work. I'm in the search field. There it is. So if I'm going to make a socket for the hat, I want to start from the head. That's the closest bone. And so what I want to do is just right click on the head bone on the joint here and just say right click, add socket. It's very easy to create a socket. And now it's made one. And so now I have a little thing in here. If I zoom in on it, you can just kind of see it's just like its own little locator type thing. And so I'll go ahead and I'll put it over here where I think his hat should go. Now, jumping ahead a tiny bit, if I were to just put his hat on that socket, it might end up being sideways. It might end up being upside down. Like it might not be oriented properly. So the orientation of a socket can be something you want to play with. You can obviously attach an object to a socket and then rotate it, but why do the extra work? Just set it up from the get. And so the thing you want to do to find out if it's oriented properly, first of all, I can kind of look at it. It'll orient it based on whatever the object before it was doing. So like the head is pointed in a certain direction, and so that's how the socket based on the head is going to do it. So if you want to make adjustments, what you should do is preview what it's going to look like once you put something on there. And so if I right click on the head socket, it'll actually give us the option to add a preview asset to it. So I can pick any static mesh from my scene and use it as a preview way to say, hey, stick something to that socket. Let's see how it works. So if I was recommended to use the chair, let's use the chair. Everyone loves the chair. So if I go and I get this to work, come on. I'm selecting you. Hang on a second. Add asset. Chair. There we go. Wasn't listening to my double click. So now it brings in a chair, and we can see, first of all, that looks a little painful going right through his shoulder and his chest. He probably can't breathe super well, so let's help him out. If I take this chair, you can see it's a preview asset. Something is up with my selection right now. That is a little funky. Interesting. That has nothing to do with my settings. So what I want to do, what I'd like to do is select the chair, but I'm having a little bit of difficulty selecting the chair. That's okay. I don't need to select the chair. With the head socket, now having a preview asset, we can see, okay, well, yeah, the orientation's wrong. It needs to be rotated 90 degrees up and probably spun around. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn on these snapping rotation thingies again, because that'll be a little bit helpful. I'm just going to go ahead and say, cool, let's take the head socket and let's just adjust it. I'll rotate it this way, and I'll rotate it this way, 90 degrees, 90 degrees. There you go. Cursing my giant screen resolution right now a little bit. And there we go. And now we can see that it's properly aligned to have, you know, the forward axis and the vertical axis of where we want to go. This is just a preview. It's not actually part of the skeletal hierarchy. It's just there, and it knows that, which is good. And so if I wanted to, I could also say remove all attached assets, and that'll take away the preview stuff. But with that, I can go ahead and hit save on this skeleton. I now have a head socket, and I could rename it if I wanted to. If you are doing this with other parts of the body that have really long names, I would recommend maybe coming up with a little bit of a shortened naming convention. But having the word socket in there is very helpful because you can just search the word socket and see all of them. So back in Sequencer, if I took my chair, let's go find the chair. We love the chair. If I bring that into my Sequencer, and we say track, attach, and I will do no preservation of any kind. I'll just say, oh yes, snap to the new location. Go to Manny. I can just type in socket, and I'm going to see he has some for his feet, and he has one for his head. If I go to the head one that I've just created, it goes to the wrong place, but that's only because it already has transformation data. So if I zero that out, if the chair goes to its 0, it'll 0 to the head socket. So if I come down here to my, remember, not the anim details, because that's for control rig stuff. If I go to details, location, I could just type zeros, or I could hit this little button that says reset to default, and it'll snap to his now, his wonderful little head socket. And then what's cool about this is, you know, if I delete the control rig and just add animation, I'll just add a run to Manny here. It's good to go. It works. Cycle that out. And so sockets are very, very handy in that you can, oops, there we go. Oh, and you can see, well, the attach track is not on for the first couple of frames. It snaps on later. It's like over there at origin before that. And so you can see, once again, with the chair selected, the chair goes from wherever it is in the outliner to snapping into the hierarchy with Manny. So sockets give you a place within the character that you can snap stuff to, and you can attach things. And attach tracks are a method to tell Unreal and the sequencer, like, hey, connect these objects. And so that's one method to go about doing this kind of stuff. And if you wanted to, once again, take this chair, right click, and say trim, right, and preserve, that will allow me to have that relationship end while keeping the location of the chair, because you typically don't want it snapping all around. So whether or not you're doing the preservation method of the whole like attach track, preserve current, whether or not using that, you can still do the trim and preserve from any attach track. So there's this. So sockets are basically locators. You do your thing. You want to orient them ahead of time. That way, any object you ever snap is always just pointed the right way. Makes it easier, and it's just a smarter workflow to have it set up for future. And then yeah, to preview and check it, preview the animation, and then make sure that, for example, if you were doing something in a character's hand, put the object in the character's hand, snap it to that location, and see if it's actually in the right spot. You might end up with it like in their hand, and oh no, I want it like offset from the palm a little bit so that when they grip it, it's not like in the mesh of their hand. You know what I mean? So check those kinds of things. It doesn't take a whole lot of time, but it'll save you some animation work down the road, and so it's a good time saving trick. Okay. So that's the level 1. Let's move on to level 2, constraints. So for anybody who has not spent a lot of time with constraints, I want to go over a quick refresher of what the deal is with them. They're going to allow you to connect stuff to each other, but the way they do it from a technical perspective is it allows them to connect the transformation inputs from one object to another. That's like technically how they work. And why would we want this over the parenting relationship that we had before? Parenting affects the hierarchy, which we kind of already covered. And where parenting is normally permanent, you can see that Unreal, it's not always permanent, but usually this is the case. Constraints, the big thing with them is that they are meant to be turned on and off, and you switch between them, and they're meant to be toggleable. That's the main thing. They also allow you to have multiple objects that you can constrain to. And so if you're switching constraints and like, this hand's going to grab something, let me switch it to this hand, and then you give it to another person, and then it goes on the table and it rolls down and falls and whatever. A tractor beam picks it up. Having it be switching around different drivers is kind of what they're designed for. And there are other methods that take up more keys. We'll show those later, but yeah, anyway, just a quick refresher. Like, here's some stuff about constraints. Here's why we like them. And Unreal has your 5 main types of constraints: transform, rotate, scale, and the look at control, which is the aim control. So really quick, I actually do want to just show you how these work for anybody who isn't super familiar. So if I go into this one, let's take our chair, our cube, and our mannequin and say goodbye to them. Yes, I'm sure it's okay. I won't be needing that other sequence. I could have made them spawnable. Oh well. So just to show you super quick, if I so remember that you're always grabbing your child first. That's the object you're putting the constraint on. So if I go to my animation mode, that's the other thing. You have to be in animation mode to do any of this, and I'll have slides on that. But if you're like looking around for where are the constraint options, make sure you're in animation mode. You probably are, because if you're using control rig, it's going to show up by default. But in the animation mode, there's a little drop down, and I'll go more in detail on this in a second. I just want to show you. But if I just say, all right, child object is going to be on the left in this case, and for all of these. So, all right, create a constraint, a translation constraint with that object. Over here, I'm going to do a rotation constraint. This one's going to be a scale constraint. This one's going to be a parent constraint, which is the most common type of constraint, which we'll talk about. And then the last one over there, I'll just do a look at. All right. So a transformation constraint, you can pretty much guess where that's going to go, right? It follows the transform. So this one now follows this one. Now I can rotate this and they're going to do their own thing. They can each rotate independently. It is only the transformation that it cares about. This one over here doesn't care about translation, but it cares about rotation. You can see where I'm going. This one doesn't care about translation or rotation. It only cares about scale. Now, the reason I show you this, like, yes, you could probably have figured that out on your own, but there are a couple little, like, hey, check this out, is important to know. And that is with the parent constraint. A parent constraint is your, which we'll talk about in more detail, but a parent constraint is your most common type of constraint because it follows the location and the rotation, and that's usually what you want. That's usually all you need. It does not by default do scale. You can, unlike in tools like Maya, you can actually just adjust the constraint by right-clicking. You can actually tell it, hey, I do want it to use scale. In this case, it's now getting confused because I had already scaled these objects, and so it's doing a little bit of weird compensation stuff. Sometimes you just need to play the playhead and it'll recalculate it. But anyway, leaving that alone for now. The big difference here that I want to point out is with a translate and a rotate, you get a certain type of behavior. If I take the parent constraint where you have translation and rotation, notice the way that it rotates. The parent object dictates where the child object rotation is going to put it in terms of the pivot point is still with the first object. Like when I rotate this one, the little one orbits, right? It orbits around it, it comes with. Whereas if I say, hey, this has a transformation constraint, let's also add a rotation constraint, because that's basically the same thing, right? Not quite, because if I now spin these, they rotate independently. So I have translate and rotate, but it behaves differently than this type of translate and rotate. And so that's not something that most people have to worry about here. Typically, you want to stick with a parent constraint for most uses. But if anybody's developing tools or rigs or anything like that, then that becomes important for them to know. And that's a behavior that you'd be used to from other places. And then the last one is an aim constraint, meaning that that other one is going to stare at this one, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, but you'll just see. It always keeps an eye on it. That's how a lot of eye rigs are set up, where you have control where the eyes follow. Anyway, so just to recap, that's what these are. Each constraint has a different purpose, and you can use them to different effects. Now, I want to sort of dive in here and talk about some of the differences. So if you're coming from Maya and you're used to constraints, or Blender for that matter, inside of Unreal, there are a couple things that I want to point out to you. The first is that in Maya, if you have a constraint on an object and then you put another constraint on that same object, now there's two constraints on that same object. What happens is the constraint blending takes over, where you have 50% influence from each object, and if you move one of them, it kind of pulls the object in the middle a little bit, like half of the, because it's following both 50%, unless you change the weights and stuff. Unreal doesn't behave that way. Unreal has one constraint active at a time, but you can have as many as you want. And so it will do an override. It's like everything else we've been doing in the sequencer. It will actually override, and you can create new constraints that will then take over from the last one until they're turned off, and it'll snap back to old ones. And so it's an override system, not a blending system. I'll show that in some examples. But that's really important to know. In fact, I actually think, yes, I think I changed that slide, so yes. Now what I'm going to do with all my many cubes here, I'll actually just show you this. The other thing is, in the slide you'll see the next thing is dynamic offset. Dynamic offset is the name for being able to animate these objects independently. So in Maya, this is one thing that a lot of people are going to be used to. In Maya, when you create a constraint on an object, you can't just say, hey, cup attached to the hand, make a constraint. You can't just do that and be happy about it. Because if you constrain a cup to a character's hand, you are directly constraining the input transformation data of that cup to the hand, meaning that hand is the only thing that can control where that cup goes. You might think, well, that sounds good. No, the problem with that is that you no longer have you have no manual control over the cup to set your own keyframes on it. Because you've just told Maya, hey, the constraint is driving the location, not me. The thing with Unreal, and so in Maya, when you do that, you usually have to set up different things with locators or groups or sort of levels of skeleton hierarchy so that you can sort of set up a system in that where you can create a constraint, but you still give yourself control and blah, blah, blah. We're not going to dive into how Maya does it, but the point is that's a process that a lot of people are going to be used to. You don't have to do that in Unreal because we have something called dynamic offset, which you can toggle on and off. And so if I have this object following, right, I have the child object up here doing its thing. In Maya, we'd be used to, if I set keys on this object and I spin it around, I wouldn't be allowed to set keys on this because the moment I hit S and set a key, I would have broken the constraint. You can see here that is not a problem. I'm still able to spin this around and do whatever I want to do, and it's working. And that's because in this constraint, if I right click, there's a little checkbox called dynamic offset. And so that allows me to say, hey, do you want to be able to animate it like in addition to its constraint? And so it works. It lets you do it, which is super cool. And there's other options in here we'll talk about, but I just want to point out that that's a major difference, and it's there by default, and that's a big deal. It seems like, oh yeah, why wouldn't that be the case? Because it hasn't been forever. So there's that. The other thing is rest position. Inside of Maya, a lot of people are going to be used to this too, where you create a constraint and you work with a thing, and then you turn the constraint off, and your object disappears. Like it snaps back to wherever it was when you first created the constraint. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but in Maya, there's like a secret checkbox called rest position. That's why that happens, because it has like this, like, I'm going to go back to rest as soon as I have the chance, and it disappears. You can turn that off, but by default, it does that for some reason. In Unreal, that's why we have compensation keyframes. So if you want to deactivate a constraint, the moment you do, so if I have all this animation, it's going on, it's doing its thing, I can just go to this constraint, and there are different ways that you might be tempted. You might right click on the constraint and say, I'm going to turn off the active state. Like you can actually find the constraint inside the, well, if I had been using a control rig, you'd see it in there. There's different options. The best way, the way you want to do it, if you want to turn off a constraint, you select your child object, you see your constraint, here it all is. There's a little button here called active keyframe. So if you just click that button, it sets a keyframe and it turns it off. So now it's on and it's off. So now the objects are independent. And I'm able to continue moving them around, right? So constrained and then like that. Now it looks like it snaps. It's not actually snap. There's a reason why it looks like it's doing weird things. I'm going to address that later, but it's actually working just fine. It's not an issue. My point is just that when I turn off the keyframe, it doesn't go flying across the scene to some other location back where it was at the beginning. The compensation keyframes automatically keep it in local space. So we'll come back to show more stuff there later. Parent constraint, transformation options. So that's just the thing where with a parent constraint in general, when you're in Maya and you create a constraint, typically you have to do all your settings before the constraint is made. So you'd go up to constraints, you'd hit your little thing and you hit your option box and you pull up the little window, you make your changes, and then you say, with those changes in mind, make my constraint. And then you have to undo it and redo it if it doesn't work. That's one of the nice things about the whole real-time Unreal ecosystem or existence. What do you call it? Whatever. That's what's nice about Unreal is that you can make changes on the fly. You don't have to undo stuff constantly. And so if you want to change the way a constraint is behaving, just right click on it. So in here where it says constraints, I can right click it and you can see there's an offset transform. So that's that, the offset between the two objects. They were sitting next to each other at one point, and you'll notice they didn't snap onto the same spot. The first object didn't jump to the second one. That's because it has this little button called maintain offset. And if I didn't want that, I can turn that off. Now, I don't know exactly where it went to. Oh, no, I think it's actually exactly where it should be. Yeah, no, it went exactly where we'd expect it. So it's now in here too. And you can see it doesn't like me trying to pull it away. It's like, no, what are you doing? You told me to be here. Let me go back. Mom, you can't make me. So if I say, okay, no, maintain the offset, I want to let them be separate. Now it's realizing like, hey, you wanted me to go here. So now I'm kind of freaking it out. I'm kind of confusing it by moving it around and creating keys and stuff. But that's how this works. And so you can change, okay, well, I wanted the offset to not be there. I can put it back to other locations. And so you can manually do it from here. Anyway, there's your offset and the dynamic offset we already covered. And then there's also scaling, which is also, you can see it kind of snapped away for a second, but then I just refreshed it and it's fine. Now, the parent constraint does transformation, rotation, and it now also does scaling. So you actually have that option to turn scaling on with a constraint just within this little option box. So there you go. And then there's this last thing that's active state, and that's whether or not the constraint is on. Like I mentioned, don't use that checkbox. It won't set up compensation keyframes, and it's just not great. It tells you when it's on or not, but use the actual little keyframe button if you want to toggle it. That's the proper way to do it. Okay. Now, a couple other options in there we'll talk about later. The last couple of things here. Aim constraints. Usually when you create an aim constraint, like in Maya or whatever, you have to tell it like, hey, what direction is up? What direction is forward? You know, you have to orient it and say, which direction are you actually pointing? You'll notice that when I created the aim constraint, I just said aim. I didn't actually have to do anything. And so if I right click on the constraint with the aim constraint, that one over here, where this object is going like this, if I click on the one here, I can right click and I go to access, and you can see this is where that's set. So you can do that on the fly as well. So you can just decide. You don't have to know ahead of time. You can do it here. I just want to point that out. And then you'll notice there's one other thing that's not available as far as I can tell, and that's in Maya. You can tell the constraint like, hey, follow the transforms, but only the Z transform. Don't listen to the other two. I have not seen that option here. I don't know if you really need it. It seems like it's more of a rigging tool than it is for animators anyway. Typically, animators aren't creating constraints that are limited. That's more for building setups and stuff. So that's really not going to affect most animators, but I want to point out that that doesn't seem to be an option at the moment. I don't know if that's planned or not, but I don't typically use that as an animator. And then the last thing is, because the constraints are able to be, so actually I should show you this last thing. Let's take this into one more step of context. Forgot to bring, I already deleted Manny. Let's bring him back. All right, let's bring in Quinn. Hello, Quinn. If I take this object, this one. Which one is it? This one? Yeah. This is the object that is, let's use this one. If I take this object, and let me get my outliner, bring Quinn in here. Okay. So if I take this object and I say constrain, parent constraint, and bring it to Quinn, I can set this to any specific control, which is totally fine, or to a bone. The reasons why you do one or the other are varied, but in this case, I would like to show you, if I pick Quinn the mesh, it immediately gives me the option for bones and sockets, which you can see the crossover here. Like, oh, we could attach it to the head joint, the head socket, which Manny and Quinn share a skeleton, and so that's why it's on her as well, even though I did it with Manny. It's actually the Quinn skeleton at the base. So let's use that. If I do that, if I do the, whoa, where's my mouse? There's my mouse. Come back. Whoa, that's weird. The thing I want to point out with that is because you can attach to bones, that's what this last one is, technically this setup is FKIK agnostic. Here's a pro tip for everybody. If you're attaching something to your character, I don't recommend attaching it to the control ring, the actual control for the wrist, for example. Because if you attach something to an FK wrist control or an IK wrist control, and then you switch your skeleton, FK or IK, your hand might go to that other skeleton, but your prop is going to be stuck to that control. And so if you want it to be FK/IK agnostic and not care which one you go to, attach it to a bone within the rig, because the bones will go to whatever part of the control rig you're using. And so that's a really good tip, so that if you are creating a constraint, it's a little bit more foolproof. You don't need to switch it to the other hand control or something weird like that. So there's that. And that's something that you can't, it's something you wouldn't be doing in Maya. That'd be typically not a great plan. And so that's a nice thing you can do here. So There's a lot of comparison, there's a lot of theory. Here are the steps, and this is all going to be in the PDF for you to download, and you can check it out. It's very easy. You want to make sure, and you've already seen most of this. Like, even though I say it's 5 steps, it's really less because you're already, you know all this stuff. Your stuff has to be in sequencer. You have to be in animation mode. If you aren't super familiar with this process, then like, you might forget this in 3 weeks and be like, how did I do it again? I can't find it. It's probably these things. But all you have to do is select your child actor. In the animation tab, you hit constraint and you pick the thing. And then, so you've literally just seen everything. If you're using a control rig, you'll have to pick the driving bone or socket that you want to actually have it follow, but that's really the only other thing to keep in mind. And so 3.5 clicks to review. If you want to create a constraint, you click add constraint. Then you pick which constraint it is, and in most cases, it's going to be a parent constraint. So by default, if you're like, which constraint do I use? It's probably parent constraint, unless you have a specific reason. Your third click is to pick the object you want it to follow. And if you picked a character with bones and stuff, what's the half click? You have to hit enter. Like if you hit the arrow keys to pick your one and then hit enter, it's not really a click, so half a click. Just to review, this is your edit constraint right-click menu, once again. So the main things to keep in mind are you have the offset options, where you can maintain your current offset between 2 objects if you want it to stay, hey, you're here, create a constraint, but keep them in place. You want to keep that way, unless you want it to snap to that location, which you might want that to happen, and which might require you to zero out some rotations or translations. The dynamic checkbox allows you to do independent animation of the constrained object, which is a new and exciting option that you have here by default. The scaling option will only show up during parent constraints. It's not there for the other ones, so that's there if you want it. Active state is a thing that you can see as like is it working, is it not? But again, don't use that. Use the actual active keyframe toggle button to key the relationship. And then I didn't mention it yet, but the last one here is bake. If you have a constraint and you have it following all this stuff, you have an object, you have a character holding a weapon, and they're doing all this animation, and for whatever reason, there are many reasons why you might want to, but for whatever reason, you decide, you know what, I don't want that object constrained to my actor anymore. I don't want that to be part of some dynamic relationship. I just want to say, cool, just give me the keyframes. Just give me the data of where that's supposed to be in world space. Oops. That is where you can just go to bake. And so if I go to, what I will do is I'll select Quinn over here. I'll delete the control rig and I'll just add, I'll add her run. And you'll see here, this cube, I think I did this cube for, let's see. When is it attached? I probably should have done this in a little bit of a cleaner scene, but you can see here, it's moving around with her. That's my point. So if I want just those keyframes on the cube itself, because there's none on the cube, it's all in Quinn. And so if I say head socket, bake, there you go. Now I just have all those keys for the object. And you can see I didn't have the constraint on for very long, apparently. And so that's baking. And we'll cover that in more detail later, but just to show you that's where it is, that's what it does. Another tip for you. Oh, well, there's a missing piece of text. Here it is. If you need to have a character drop an object, don't use the same constraint to have them reconnect to it later. Make a new one. I have a couple examples I want to show you, but I think we might take a break first. But I just want to sort of give you this tip so you can think about it. If you have a character grabbing something and then they drop it and then they pick it back up, that is an additional constraint. Can you do it again? Can you use the original one? Like, sure, but that's a recipe for disaster. It's going to remember the history of kind of where it was before. It's going to want to reuse that data. Just trust me on this. If you have a character holding something and then they drop it and you want to have them pick it back up, or they throw it in the air and they catch it in the same hand, just make an additional constraint for that second time that it gets attached. You'll be happier. So I have some examples that I want to show you. and I've been keeping an eye on the chat. I'm actually going to start with the requests because I have just enough time to do this one, in addition to the ones I have. So to talk about having a character stare at something and having an aim constraint, for example, because aim constraints are a little bit more rare. Parent constraints are most of my examples. Um, an aim constraint is the one where you can have a character look at something, and that's actually how certain things are built inside of things like MetaHuman, or yeah, into the MetaHuman face. And so it's invisible by default, but I mentioned this in my intro to animation class that there is a face GUI. So if you turn, well, I mean, this whole thing is the face GUI, but there's an eye control hidden inside the switches. Whoop. So I turn that on. This is in that first class, but this is an aim constraint. We have this little object and the eyes follow it. So that's exactly how that works. Now you might be tempted to say, oh, well, how do I do that with my character's head? And you can do that. If I take the head, for example, and I say constrain, look at, and then I pick something, I need to actually hit escape and over here. If I say head control, constrain, look at, and then I pick this health pack, if I move this health pack around, you'll see that it does work. Now it's got its offset by default. And so if I go back over here to the options, you can see that there's sort of like a weight blending thing happening in here where it's sort of determining an axis based on, you know, it uses the offset that it had initially, which is nice because there's really no way to otherwise, like if it didn't do this for you, good luck trying to get this position back. But if you're like, oh, I don't want that, I want it to snap right on, well, then you can play with these values and try to mess with it yourself. I typically don't do this, and I think in this case you're going to have some. Oh yeah, it works. I was going to say you might end up with some problems if the orientation isn't set correctly, but in this case, metahumans are done exactly the way you would expect, which is nice. I actually hadn't tried that myself ever, but you can see now his head is going there. Now the eyes, not so much, because they already have something they're looking at. And so if you want him to actually be looking where his head is going, you could potentially, you could change different settings. You could change it so that, the eyes are no longer following the IK thing. They're more FK eyes. There's a variety of ways you can do it. You could have this thing follow the prop. You could constrain that, all kinds of different methods. So if I say constrain, parent constraint, actually, I don't know if I want to parent. I'll just do a, I don't want a parent constraint in this case. I just want to do a translation constraint on the health pack, and I'll right click and I'll turn off the offset. And you can see now he's going to look at that object, and his eyes and his head are going to go with it. Now that totally works. And now he's always going to look at it, which, for better or worse. But I don't really recommend you do that in most cases because it's not super realistic. Like that's not how we behave. So no, diving into like animation territory, your eyes typically lead actions before the head goes. The brain, the eyes, the face, the head, then the body, then the dialogue. Like there's an order to how things usually happen. And so we don't perfectly lock on to everything we stare at. Our eyes can move independently of our head. Like if everything's locked together, it's going to feel very uncanny valley, very unnatural. So be careful of how much you want to do this. And even with, just the head following or the eyes following something, our eyes don't smoothly move and follow things. They dart, and our head doesn't, lock onto an object. We have to kind of follow it and trail behind a little bit. So if you're in a time pinch and you need it to follow and it's far enough away, go for it. But if you're looking for an up close performance, don't get too wrapped up in the aim constraint. There's a lot you can still do manually with arcs and various things that you won't want to just have it driven by another object. But I did want to show you how to do it. So there's that. Okay. Let me switch over to a different example. So now, let's do this. That's the last one I'm going to show you. Oh, right. No, I remember. I had an example for you, and it broke. That's one of the so one of the things that I need to tell you about constraints is they are a little tricky. They don't always work super, super well all the time. They usually work, but sometimes, depending on what you're doing, if you like undo in the middle of constraint, or if you've got too tricky a setup, be sure to save often, back up your level sequences, make new copies and stuff, as I mentioned. But and you should be fine. Like, it shouldn't be that big of an issue. But like, I made some examples on a home computer, and then tried to move it onto this computer, and it didn't really like it, and then it was kind of popping all over the place, and so I've decided to just let's remake it for you because it's weird. So just it's a new tool. There's a couple things here and there that you might run into, and so um, there's that. But if I bring Quinn in here, and I'm going to bring her into the sequencer, and I'm also going to bring in a weapon, which, as I mentioned, all the props are from the there we go, from Lyra. So if I bring in a rifle, there's a static mesh and a skeletal mesh. I'll use the skeletal mesh because it actually has a little bit of a rig, so you'll see a few more examples here. I saw another question in Slack about like, hey, like how do you snap a weapon into a hand and make sure that it's like perfectly aligned and doesn't crash with the geometry or anything? And as was correctly pointed out in the answer to that, there's not a way to just like snap it to a bone and it's perfect every time. That would have had to have been set up by whoever created the rig or the socket or whatever. My recommendation is, if you have, an object that you're going to consistently have your characters grab, like it's a first person shooter, they're always going to grab the gun. Well, set the pose first, like pose the hand how you want it, just like this, like put the object in there, pose the hand, get it feeling the way you want it. And then, make sure that it works in context, pose the fingers, get it all happening, and then go and add your socket, add your weapon bone socket thing. And then bring in the preview asset and make sure it's positioned just right. So if you do the pose first in the sequencer in context with your object, and then you create the bone or the socket, and then make sure it's just aligned to where you had it in the viewport, well, then when you make future, snap two, it'll always go to that same spot. And as long as you're using the same pose, if it's in the pose library, for example, then you're good to go. It'll always snap to that spot. But there's not just like a default snap to make it work every time option for you. So there's that. Now, I do want to show you this. So a lot of times you might have need of a more elaborate constraint than just, oh, I want to stick something to the hand. Maybe you want a two-handed setup. Maybe you want to have a character holding a rifle where, obviously they're holding it with one hand and the other hand is on the rifle and everything's connected together. I want to show you how to do this. In fact, I'll start off. I saw that question just pop up. I'll have the weapon start over here and come to the hand, the equivalent of them picking it up. So I'll go ahead and I'll set keys on everything because I want to have my first keys all set. So if I go over here, say great, frame 0, everything's over here. And then frame 15, I will bring this weapon over to the hand and get it close enough to where we can say, that's fine. It's good enough. Cool. That's fine. I'm not getting nitpicky. I'm not animating right now. I'm demoing. It's so hard sometimes not to just like, wait, let me get it perfect. So anyway, so I'll grab my rifle. Here it comes. It's animating on its own. And I'm just going to separate everything by a couple of keyframes just for the sake of showing you what's going on. I don't have to like, okay, I need a couple of frames here, then I set my constraint. Do it whenever you want it. I'm just doing it so that we can clearly see when everything happens. If I take this rifle and I say create a constraint on frame 20, create a parent constraint, like I mentioned before, I can constrain it to a variety of things. I can put it on the hand control, I can put it on the bones. In Maya, I tend to use the finger controls because if you can't use the bones, you can use the finger controls because those will work between FK and IK as well. But in Unreal, we don't actually have to do that. We can, like I said, go to the bone. So if I say parent constraint to Quinn, if I type in weapon, you'll see she actually already has a weapon right hand. There's already a bone specifically for the weapon. A lot of game assets will do that because sockets in this type of workflow are super common. If you're more used to feature a TV, you may not be used to that in your rigs, but typically there is already a weapon spot. So if the character comes with pre-made animations or you get it from the marketplace or something, and it has, all these animations, it might actually just snap right into the correct place and have all the posing be done correctly because this is what was intended to be used with this asset. So, pro tip. Anyway, now that I've made the constraint, it automatically does my compensation keyframe. So now it's in the right space. You can see there's some little like keyframe thingies in here, but it's fine. And I didn't really point it out, but the rifle is not parenting to the mannequin the way that the attach track was, which is good. That's why we like this method. So sword. The gun comes over here. She grabs onto it. I'm going to wait a couple of frames. I'll wait till 30 just for even numbers. I'll key her arm. Should have done earlier. Go like this. You can see she's got it. Come over here, set some keys, and I'll just bring the arm over like this. Do-do-do-do-do. Do-do-do-do-do. There you go. And I want to have her grab it. Now, with the other hand, I tend to use FK for most of my animation, but if you're going to have this other hand grab the gun, it can't be an FK. We want it to be IK. That's the thing with FK and IK, which hopefully you already know, that FK is much more about arcs and posing, or arcs and swinging motions. And if you want to have it lock onto something, you want IK. So I'm just going to grab this mannequin, and I'm going to go arm, left, switch it to IK. And I'm going to do that a few frames earlier just so I don't have to deal with it later. So I'll go over here on frame 30. There we go. I'll go to frame 40. And I'll just bring this over and have her grab the weapon. And I'm just going to pose this really rough. Now I have a couple other examples for this kind of thing that I'm going to open up in a little bit, but I'm going to save those for when you're ready for them. For now, this will get you the idea that cool, like now we have this hand comes in, she grabs it, it's beautiful animation, don't you just love it, ship it. And with this, I'll wait a couple of frames so you can see it. And with this hand control selected, this is a terrible pose, but it's okay. Add constraint, parent constraint, rifle. In this case, the rifle has a rig to it, so it has different options of where I can put stuff. I'm just going to say grip. It doesn't really matter in this case. And now I'll wait a couple more frames. I'll key this, and then I'll say, all right, a couple more frames, and up we go. And she can raise it up. Key the wrist, and key the wrist. So you can see, I've now created a system where the gun is on its own, it attaches to the hand, follows over here, the other hand grabs onto it, and we go. Just like that. And if at any point we decide, okay, cool, that was great, we love it, I'm going to go ahead and just, key everything, it's beautiful. Now I want to disconnect it. All I have to do is say, okay, this hand has a constraint on it, I'm just going to click the little toggle button, and it turns it off. You can see that it turned unblue. It was blue, now it's not blue anymore. And if I open the control rig, somewhere in here, if I open the hand IK control, you can actually see there's a little layer bar that has the constraint. So you can visually see it. Now again, there are handles. I don't recommend you move them yourself because it won't do the compensation keyframes. And I also would like to point out that if I, for example, if I adjust, how do I want to do this? Well, I don't have a good way to show you this right now, but I just want to point out the feature so you know about it. If you right click on a constraint, there's a compensate key. If you, activate or deactivate a constraint and it creates a compensation key, and then you change that pose later to where now you have a pop because it's different, because your object is moving around but the constraint already exists and now they don't match, you can right click and you can say compensate key and it'll redo that keyframe for you. So it'll re-snap it to that location. Or not re-snap it, but it'll make a new compensation key. But anyways, now that I've turned off the constraint, I can now take this object, I can move it off to the side, I can take this object and I can move it, and I can separate them just like that. Now here's where I want to show you a trick. This is the big thing I want to show you. I've showed you all this. Oh, look, it's working great. Wow, connect. What happened to the hand there? You might be like, oh no, he's lied to us this whole time. It's not as easy as we thought. As soon as he disconnects the constraint, it breaks. It's just like Maya. It's just like every other tool. Why do you hurt me so? It's actually not. It's a bug, but it's not like a real problem. Um, if you select the object that had the constraint that you deselected, the thing that you're animating, as soon as you turn off a constraint and it does its compensation keyframe, it doesn't like auto spline the new curve. So if you just look at your curve editor, everything's fine, except that you just have this like weird explosion of curve data. And all it is the tangent handle. And it's usually the in tangent handle at the end, like when you start animating it yourself. You're like, oh, cool, I've turned off the constraint. I'm going to start animating it. And you set a new keyframe. As soon as you start animating it, you're going to think, what have I done? I've broken it. No, it's just that as soon as you make a new keyframe, it thinks, cool, you want tangent handles that look like that. All you need to do is grab these and just hit auto spline and just say, no, go back to like normal. And you're good to go. That's it. So it's not actually a problem. You'll run into that pretty early on if you're animating with constraints, and you'll freak out going like, oh no, it's broken. But it's not actually broken. It's just a bug in the way that they do the tangent things. So easy fix, luckily, and you're good to go. And so, and if I want to have the him drop the weapon now, I can grab the gun. I can turn off the active constraint as a frame 90. I can key it, and then I can drop it. Down it goes. And you can see as soon as I start animating it, it freaks out. It does weird things. And that's probably, yep, there it is. See, it's just the tangent. So if I fix the tangent, there it goes. And it's fine. It's not a big deal. It's a little bit annoying, but it's really not the end of the world because it's an easy fix. And so now, there you have it. So now I have a full constraint set up with multiple hands. I've done all this stuff. I didn't have to do any weird hierarchy stuff that you'd be used to in other tools. And that's how you would set up a multi-hand constraint as well. You would have one hand drive it. You can have it in FK or IK, whatever you want. As long as it's the one you intend to animate, doesn't matter what you choose. You attach the weapon to that, and then you can attach any other hand to the weapon, and you can have them all follow. Okay. I do have a couple of other examples, but I'm going to save them for a little bit later because I want to show you one more thing so that you have some more context. Let me actually just make sure. Yes. Yes. Okay. Okay. So back to our slides. Snapping and dynamic space switching. So this is the last segment of our class, and it's a really cool section that I think you'll like. So there is a tool in Maya called AnimBot, which a lot of people have heard of. It's not native to Maya. It's an additional plugin that a lot of animators buy and pay for. But inside AnimBot is a tool called Xform copy paste, Xform relationship, things like that. Basically, what it allows you to do is you can say, hey, there's an object moving through the scene. I want to have another object attached to it like they're constrained to each other, but I don't actually want to have a constraint. I just want them to like follow each other. And it's similar to like making a constraint or a locator and then baking it. Like there's all these different kinds of ways you can do it. There are many workarounds to get that effect. We have that here. So this is the tool that in the intro to animation class, I mentioned it and I told you that I'd show it to you in more detail another time. Now is that time. So there's a thing called snapping. And that's what I was talking about here, Xform relative transform. That's a thing in AnimBot that you might be used to if you're an animator. But what it's going to allow you to do is you can pick two objects. You say, hey, you're the child, you're the parent, copy that one, do what they're doing. You can keep the offset if you want to. You can just limit it to just translation or just rotation or both or whatever. And you can do this with additive animation. This is a really cool tool, but it works really well in the context of constrained. And so let me show you how this works. If I had all this stuff, right? I did all this work and it just looks amazing. We just love it. What I can do, which actually one thing I should do just to show you, I didn't get a chance to show you this earlier really that well. So I'm just going to take this constraint. I'm going to take this rifle and from this point, I'm going to duplicate it. Yes, please. I'm going to make a second rifle, and I'm going to delete its transfer. Oh, no, not that one. I'm going to delete its transformations as of this moment and this moment, and make sure there's no constraints. Okay. So I'm just making a duplicate of the rifle. So the rifle that I've already done stuff with, real quick before I forget to do it again, I'm just going to right click. I'm going to say bake. Just so you can see what that looks like. That if you bake something, it now, ignore the one that's floating. That's just keyframe data. Get out of here. Whatever. I'll just leave that. Fine. You can see things that started to freak out a little bit. The hand is kind of broken off. So if I actually meant to point this out, if you have multi-levels of constraints and you can leave it that way, leave it that way. There's no reason to necessarily change it. But if you need to change it, start with the most childest of child. Start with the youngest child and work your way up. Because you can see that by baking this gun, I've broken the hand because it's no longer part of the system. It's a little weird. Bake the hand first, then bake the gun, then be on your way, and it's fine because the gun was sort of a dependency for the hand, so that can get a little weird. Anyway, I'm gonna get rid of this entirely now. Yes, goodbye. Thank you very much. Bye. If I wanted to have the gun here follow the hand, but not actually have to do a constraint, I don't want to deal with it. I just want to manually animate it. What you can do is you go to your snapper tool right here, which is really large on my screen again. There we go. Better. So I pick the gun and I say, you are the child actor. And then I pick something on the hand. In this case, I could grab the wrist control, it's fine, and say, you are the parent. Because I'm not actually creating a constraint, it doesn't matter if it's FKIK, like it doesn't matter in this case. Unless I am doing like an FKIK switch somewhere in the middle, then I guess it would matter. But in this case, it's fine. I'm going to pick the frame rate, and so I'll say from frames 15 through, I don't know, 15 through 115. So I'll go 15 to 115. That is the range through which I want to copy this. Now, I don't necessarily want it to snap to that location, which is what it's meant for. It allows you to snap. I'm going to say keep the current offset. I want to keep this position relative to that control. I want position and I want rotation, go. And just like that, it looks like a constraint. Very easily, it looks like a constraint. Because what it's doing is it's just copying every time that the one control moves, it's copying that and putting it on this asset, but with that offset. And so I click on the gun, you can see that it does have its own animation data now. It's basically kind of motion capped it. It's baked it. It's to me, it's a more effective way of baking this. So if your plan is to do a constraint, do all your work, and then bake it out at the end, I'd almost just recommend using the snapping tool. I think it's a lot easier. Unless you are trying to constrain something, do that separate dynamic animation, and then bake it after, that's fine. Then that's probably good to go for that reason. But if you're not doing all that secondary animation on top of the actual constrained object, then this just gives you the same thing with a few less steps. But if I do want to animate the gun separately, I need to add an additional track of animation, or I need to adjust these curves. It just depends on how you want to work. But this is a really great option to just create the effect of a constraint without actually having to constrain anything. Because as soon as I'm done with this, I can just drop this to the floor and I can animate it separately because it's not constrained. There's no relationship. I just have keyframe data. So that's the snapping tool. It's great. It's really helpful. And then, oh, right. And then where's that button? Oh, right. So there's a thing in here. I mentioned a thing for keep aligned. I'm actually going to show you a demo for that a little bit later. So we're going to come back to this keep aligned thing. But that's just in there for your notes in the future. Okay. So that's a really cool tool. And now I want to talk about spaces. So spaces, which by the way, I guess one last thing before I move on, actually, just I don't want to forget to mention it. If I have Quinn here, let me just take a copy of her. Yes. Move over here. Goodbye to control rig. And take another one of these. Duplicate. Yes. gimme, and get rid of all the animation on that. Get rid of the transformation on that. There you go. Just to point it out, if I add, oops, wrong cycle, that's okay. If I have her animated like this, that's not a problem. I can still do that. I'll try it with the snapping tool. If I just take the gun thing and say snapper and say you are the child and then she is the parent, in this case it'll ask what do you want to attach to, and I'll just say weapon, and then we can once again we can pick whatever socket we want. In this case, I'll leave it alone. I'll do the same thing. I'll leave it be, and we'll say that she's holding it funny. She's holding it like that for some reason. Snap. It works just fine. So just wanted to point out that there's no issues with it being control rig versus animation sequences. It's the same process. It's just keeping in mind that like, oh, I probably should have checked her animation first because then it snaps to T-pose and snaps over here. Anyway, works just fine. Moving on. Spaces. So spaces, there are two kind of contexts just to point out. You should already know about the first one, which is that you can change your transformation space while you're working, which is like local space or world space. And that I showed you in the other class, but that's this little button right here in the middle. And that's the thing that allows me to have, for the example, this gun, you can see the up axis is this way and the side and front axes are oriented with the world. And if I switch this little button here, it now aligns with the actual actor in the scene. So you might want that when you're animating, and hopefully you already know about this. I use the hotkey Control tilde to swap between them. That's all in my other class, but that's spaces for like transformation. But that's really important to know because when you're working with various parts of your rig, you can actually switch the spaces that the controls live in, and then you can modify them with this in mind as well. And so if I switch over here, let's bring in Bungee Man. Let's not bring in Bungee Man. Bungee Man gets a little weird with spaces. You can do it with spaces, but we've done a few troubleshooting calls already where he's a little funky. Let me show you with a new copy of, let's do Manny. So if I take Manny and I bring him in, check this out. So by default, if I have his arms go into IK, an IK control will stay locked in its world position. What I mean by its world position is that the mannequin asset thinks, the Manny asset thinks that this main mover on the ground, that's its world. That's what it considers to be its world. If I flip this over, everything follows over there, right? And that's how you usually want it. And so when I move any other control, his hands and his feet stay locked pretty much where they want to be, except for, where they don't stretch. But this is the sort of typical behavior of an IK control. It wants to behave in its world space. It's global. I guess we'll call it global space. But various controls actually have other options of what they can follow, and different rigs are set up with different things. And so if I move his torso, you can see here, his head just follows his neck. I call this the popsicle stick problem, where his head just follows his body. That's not really how we behave. We usually will like keep our head oriented like the chicken in those videos, the stabilizer chicken. And so if I take the head control, there's options usually built into the rig for this kind of thing. So if I click on his little head control, there's actually a thing in here that says head local, and I can turn that off. And that allows me, oops, I didn't actually do anything. Am I confused? Maybe I'm thinking about this. Oh, maybe it's the neck. I don't know. Usually something like that works. It's okay. It doesn't really change what we're going to do. What you're able to do with this is you can actually change the space that an object is in. Now, in this case, this is not going to be a very good example or option, but I just want to kind of show you at a very high level like what this does. Oh, is it the spine? Oh, thank you. Oh, wait. Well, I'll come back to that. The thing I want to show you is if you take a control, this is not really meant for the head in this case, but I'm going to do it anyway. If I click on, in the animation tab over here, there's a spaces drop down. And you can see that there's a couple of options. This one's really not meant to be used for different ones. If I click on the hips, for example, or sorry, not the hips, the hands actually have a variety of options because they're a little bit more common to be used here. But just to show you for fun, if I take his head and I set it to world space, I can just hit this little button, and now his head is in world space, which technically means it's an IK control now. Now, you wouldn't really want this for the head, which is why I kept giving all these caveats, because like, yeah, I can do whatever I want to do, and now I can lean him forward and his head's not going to follow, but his head's really not going to follow. So again, not the greatest example, but this is what Spaces does. Spaces allows you to put the control or the whatever into a certain space so that you can adjust how it behaves with the rest of your scene. Now, a lot of FK controls like the head are not a good choice for this. It's really the IK controls that shine with this workflow. And so if I take his hands, which are currently locked off just wherever they are, you may be asking yourself, I have a character who I want to have them like just like face palm and just like keep their hand attached to their face. Do I have to make a constraint? You can do a constraint, you can do an attach track, you can do all that same stuff. Let me enunciate. You can do an attach track, you can do a constraint, you can do different options. But you don't have to. You can just have the hand attached to the face using spaces. The trick with this, the way that you know whether or not you can do this, this is an internal process per rig. So because, I mean, this is one skeleton, this is going to work just fine. I wouldn't do this for like a cup or something. You can't do this for like between objects. It's within the actual asset. And so if I take this hand and I put it on his head, it will not stay there. His body will move, his chest can move, his head can move. It's not really paying attention. And normally you would create a constraint for this sort of a thing in Maya or whatever tool. But in this case, I can grab his hand IK control, and you can see there's different options. There's parent space, which in this case is following the global. There's world space, which is truly world space. So again, if I move this, the whole thing moves. But if I take this and switch it to world space, it's really world space now. So that's a really quick and easy way to just switch your controls into world space, and then you can bake stuff down. So for workflows where some animators here will go, oh my gosh, I see how I can use that. Cool. For the rest of you, I'm not going to go into it right now. But that's the way you can switch to world space. You can go to body control, which I believe is the main hip control. So if you want to put his hands on his hips, you would just say hands on hips, and then that would then work. And so if I do that, you'll notice too, every time I click it, the hand isn't moving. It's doing the compensation keyframe. It's switching the keyframe data into that proper space so that I can keep working without it snapping. So now, if I grab his hips, the hand stays with the head. But it's following the hips and not the head. So again, if I move the head, it's not actually connected, which is where this is really handy, just like a constraint. If I say, you know what, none of these are really doing it for me, I'm going to add a new space myself. I can just add one. I can type in head, and you'll notice there's a whole bunch of options in here. Let me do this. It's looking for controls primarily, but you can also do bones. I don't see my head socket, but that's okay. I don't believe you can do sockets because they're not actually, sockets are sort of a passive thing. They're not like a rig thing. And so if I say head bone, because again, then it wouldn't matter what FKIK, that kind of stuff. If I go head, now it gives it as an option. I can toggle to it. And now when I move his hand comes along for the ride. Now I can't do that and say, let me put a hand on your shoulder. That won't work. Like I can't be like shoulder, clavicle, left, because it's going to go to the character's like own left shoulder. So you can do that, but you can't put it to another character. That's a constraint. But if you do stuff to the character themselves, you can use space switching to adjust how that control is going to work. And so I've already run through all this, so let's review it. If the objective is to move, in this example, if the objective is to move some part of the body and keep the contact without needing to use a constraint or an attach track, this is the option that you might want to use. And this works really great for I key controls within a rig, um, as long as you know what you're doing. And you've now seen what you're doing. There's a couple cases where this will get a little funky depending on the rig that you're using. If you're using a certain type of mannequin rig, which I'll show you in a second. I will say spaces are a little buggy, more than a little buggy. I think spaces are a bit buggier than constraints with certain cases, specifically Bungee Man. Bungee Man, we've had a few. I mean, it works. Like if you're using just like the hands and the whatever, um, it works. Don't be afraid of it. Back up your level sequence first, then try it. That's my recommendation. Is like save it first, save it, duplicate it, give it a shot. If it works, great. And if it like freaks out and does anything weird, you can just go back and try a different option. But always do a quick backup beforehand, just in case, until it's a little bit more stable. So again, this is just the documentation of it. Is like if you don't have the space turned on, the hand is still in its own default space. And once you put it on there, it compensates the keyframe, keeps it in the same location, and then you're good to go. And so you can switch. You can switch as you go as well. So you can switch the space as needed throughout the shot by clicking on the different ones. You can also bake. There is a bake button that I didn't use. I'm not going to use it because I don't typically bake stuff. But you can right click. I mean, there's no right click for this, but there is a bake option, and that'll pull this up. And you can bake to a specific space. This is actually really important. I don't typically bake, but if you do, you're going to want to know this. If I have, it's attached to the head, I'm doing all this stuff. If I hit bake, you can bake it into a different space than you've been animating in, which is huge. So if you're doing, a walk cycle in place, like a little treadmill walk cycle, which a lot of people do. And then you take the main mover and you move it through space and, you want to switch it to bake in a world space. This is the type of workflow that you could be using. You can, and you can do the reduce keys thing where it doesn't bake every single key, but there's not at the moment an option to do like bake on 2s, bake on 4s. It's just more of the tolerance thing, which anyway, I don't bake very often, so this isn't a tool I use very much, but there it is. Some of you will need it. So, and then there are all the, some controls have more by default, so you can add it their own. You can add your own with the little plus button, and then make sure that once you've added it yourself, you actually click on it. Because when you add the plus button and you add it, it'll put it in the list, but it may not go to it. So you need to actually tell it, oh yeah, now I want to use it. And of course, there's baking. And keeping in mind that if you bake stuff, you can then layer and add more data and that kind of thing. Now, I want to show you one. This is the example I want to jump to now. I want to show you kind of a trick, not a trick, but it's sort of like a trick question. You will find this example in you'll find this example in the project file when you download it. There's a spaces basic ready, which I think I have some assets in here. I'd say these are from the other example. I'm gonna actually I won't delete them. I'll just hide them. There. You too. Get out of here. All right. Am I confused? Where am I looking? Hang on a second. Oh, let me just go over here. Oh yeah, it was the wrong one. Whatever. What I wanted to show you, it is the same thing. You've already seen this one, so I don't actually need to do it again. I made this one from scratch, but it was the same thing. I just posed out a character here, and then I posed her putting her hand on her head, and then she moves over. And the only thing that is different, and the thing that happens, the trick to it, is, in my particular case, this is just my workflow. I wanted to show you an alternate option. You can see that through here, I think I did it with a bake or something, but she's in FK, she switches to IK, and as soon as she's in IK, her hand goes from parent space into head space. And then once it's in head space, she moves around and we're good to go. Really, nothing I just showed you was anything different. I want to show you the other one. So this is the tricky one. Notice this is a slightly different rig for Quinn. This is the other rig. This is because every time you have the mannequin, you have the option to add, right, like the different control rigs. And I showed you body and basic biped in the other class. Body is the one I've been using that has just all the controls, and basic biped is the one that has a little bit more of those kind of foot roll things, and it has a little bit more of an IK, where you move the little diamonds and stuff. So if any of you are using this, you might find that as you move the wrist around, its default behavior is to orient the wrist while you translate. Translation and rotation are kind of grouped into one control here. And this is a little bit of a tricky situation in that if I switch I'm setting keyframes. Well, this is perfect. It's already got the animation. You can see here, I already have the animation in here so that it will bring, well, I've added an extra key, but she'll bring her hand to her head, and then she moves her head. So let's go ahead and attach it. So somewhere in the middle here, I'll use 35. I'm going to take her hand control, and I'm going to say, switch spaces. Add head. Add the head control, or head control, head, doesn't matter. I'll do the head control to show you a different example. So if I switch her to the head control, it almost works. See how it, and by the way, see how like I actually already had keyframes on her hand, but now it comes with, it's kind of cool. I didn't have hand keyframes specifically, but it comes with it. Anyway, you can see it almost works. It follows along, but the rotation's funky. Like, see how her hand is facing us right now? And her hand is still kind of facing us? The problem with this is that this control is not actually responsible for the rotation right now. It's being like auto oriented based on where that is. And so for this rig in particular, you might need to make an adjustment if you plan to do space switching. Somebody was doing a shot with rock climbing, and we're doing constraints, I think, so I don't think this mattered. But if you were doing spaces with that, if you're doing spaces with that rig, you'd run into this problem. So if I type in, the filters down here, lock, in the sequencer, lock will show me hand lock wrist setting. And this is the attribute that controls that orientation thing. When I turn it off, you can see that it goes back to just a default position. Delete this other keyframe. When I do that, obviously it breaks the wrist because now it says, "Oh, cool, let's just orient to wherever this box is," and it breaks it. That's just because I haven't been rotating it. And so if I, ooh, don't crash, don't crash, don't crash. Why are you doing this to me? Basically, what I want to do is I just want to rotate it myself and have it be wherever it needs to be. Now, I actually do think I'm going to crash. I've done this before, and I experienced something similar. I just forgot that if I do the space switching workflow stuff first, I do the space switch, and then I turn the wrist off, and then I start rotating it, it tends to freeze up. So my recommendation is don't do the space switch stuff yet. Turn off the wrist, let it snap back if you're using this rig, do the rotation, get it into position, then do your space switching, and it won't freak out on you. I'm actually gonna have to kill Unreal really quick. But that's the trick. That's the hack to not have this crash, which, say goodbye. I'm gonna pull this back up. Oh, thank goodness. I thought I crashed Zoom for a second. I was like, no. But anyways, that's a gotcha. So that's where I mentioned that spaces are a little bit unstable still, and there's some weird bugs. That's one that I would recommend, that if you are using that rig, and if you're not using that rig, then that's not useful to you at all. But if you're using that basic IK rig, or whatever it's called, the basic rig, basic body, then just know that the hands aren't going to behave the way that they will in the first examples. You're going to need to turn off that setting and then go into space switching. So just do it in that order. Okay. Now, while that's opening, I do have one last example, but we don't need to wait for it because I have one more slide for you. Which one to choose? I've showed you 3 different methods, at least 3 different methods. So which one do you do? Which one's right for you? And I want to give you a pros and cons list for each. So let's go through it together. Screenshot time. So for sockets and attach tracks, the first option I showed you. The pros, it's very stable, actually works very well. It's very reliable. It does one thing and it does it well. You still have the dynamic offset and the compensation keyframes, right? When you create an attach track and you set it up, you can set it so that it keeps its position and you still have independent animation control over that object. And so if it's just like a mug, a cup, a rifle, if it's just like a static prop that you're just gonna have them hold, it's a great choice. It actually works very, very well. And especially if you have a very simple setup. If you just have the character holding it the whole time, or they pick it up or put it down once, great option. If it if it's a problem that it changes the parent hierarchy, that it literally becomes a child of the other option of other actor, then maybe not the best choice. Give me a second to reload. Well, here's my constraint systems class. Here it is. Now I didn't show this, but you can only have one attached track at a time. I mean, you can create more for an asset, but realistically, you don't want to be like trying to layer them on top of each other. Like, oh, I'm going to hand this to another character and like have them hand it off. You're going to want to be very careful about like, okay, get to that frame, turn it off, trim and preserve, and then start the next one, give it to that. Like, you can do it that way, but you have to be kind of careful about how you go about it. So I like to just say, you know what, treat it as one at a time. It's not super flexible for a lot of more common animation workflows. And then the other con is it has that leftover key at the end. So don't forget that once you turn off the trim and preserve, it will have that key at the very end that it'll like float away. So you have to remember to turn that off. There we go. Here's my thing. Not now, not now. Be gone with you. So next option, animation constraints. It's typically most flexible. It's if a little bit new. You still have dynamic offset and compensations. I apologize if you can hear a siren in the background. Not much I can do about that. We don't have time for me to wait for it. And the thing is, it's very easy to toggle them, right? You saw how easy it was to turn that off and just, you just hit the little button and it turns it off. Very, very easy. Now, I didn't show you this. As soon as this comes back up, okay, I will show you this now. If I go over, oh man, I saved over when this wasn't all done. That's okay. If I go to my animation mode, I want to delete the constraint. The way to delete a constraint, by the way, is go to the constraints menu and just hit the X. That is the proper way to delete a constraint. I was trying to do it at one point in the sequencer, which I don't know why I was doing that. That's not really not a recommended workflow. But what I wanted to show you is this. If I duplicate this cube, all right, I'm going to do this. I have 2 cubes at the bottom and 1 at the top. Don't worry, I know you can count, but I just thought you'd like to know. I'm going to take this top object. I'm going to constrain it, and I'm going to say, give me a parent constraint to you. So as of frame 0, here we are. And I'm going to key this, and I'm going to put it over here, and we're going to go that way, and we're going to spin. Amazing. Beautiful. Love it. And then I'm going to come over here to frame 26, or I'll go 30, just for fun. And then I'm going to grab my object, and I'm going to say, you know what? I want a new constraint. I want another one for this one. And I'm going to say, you know what? Now I'm going to have this thing go, wee, and go over there. Now, right off the bat, this is already more impressive than what you are used to in Maya. Because if you create a constraint in general in Maya, like this one, the second one here, if you create a constraint, usually it creates it for all time. It'll assume you've always had it on. So you have to immediately be like, create a constraint, and now immediately go back a frame, turn off the constraint I just made, and then key it so that it only turns on when I want it. And then also, if you had multiple objects with a constraint, like I mentioned before, it'll blend between them. They both kind of share. In this case, as you can see, that is not the case. It does not, they don't blend, they don't share. It has overridden it. So if I click this main one, you can see both constraints are still there. Both are still active. But this one has no effect because this one is lower on the list. It's newer and it's more powerful. And so if I say, you know what, I'm done with you. I'm going to key this object and I'm going to spin it around and show that I can. And then I'll a couple frames later, I'll say, great, turn off that one. I turn off the new one. I have animated all 3 of these objects ever since the constraints were made. If this were any other software, that cube would immediately have gone somewhere else. But it didn't. It compensated properly with all the animation and context. And now this constraint is still there. So it's still active. I can still do stuff with it. And I can still be, messing with this all the while. And when I'm done with it, and you say, you know what, I'm done with the constraint, I'm going to turn that off too. And then I can go on my merry way. Oops, hit undo. Come on, drag. So just to show you, I didn't key my rotation, so whatever, but that was me. And I'm pretty sure actually that even might have had to do with, I should probably always check when you do the constraint workflows, always double check that, oh, where are you? I didn't name anything. This one, this one, this one. Yep, there you are. Always double check your splines. Because check that out. They're doing all kinds of weird things. That's why my rotation's freaking out. Set that to auto. I'm going to have a much more reasonable rotation. Yeah. So just keep an eye on that. All right. So that's the, I didn't really get a chance to show you that, but that's the stacking. So you can stack constraints on top of them and you just keep adding them and it's fine. Like it's not going to hurt anything. So just keep track of the order or have better naming conventions for your cubes in this case. Now the cons, it's not super stable. Now it's worked great for this demonstration for the most part, but as I mentioned, sometimes you might, close and reopen the sequencer and things are a little funky. Usually it's fine, but I can't pretend like there's not some issues here. You're gonna run into some stuff, so do your little backups and double check your stuff. That's the thing. You might end up needing to bake stuff. It's not always super stable. If you change a pose after you've made a key, you have to redo the compensation keys. That's really not a surprise. Like that's true with any tool, but that's just if you're doing constraints, that's a byproduct of constraints. That's potentially a con. That's more work. And then the last thing is rogue curve tangents, which is, I'm going to say, a 5.2 not super stable issue. But yeah, when the curve tangents just start going and doing their thing, as you just saw, that's a con because you have to remember to deal with that. And then the last section, snapping in spaces. There are no tools, there's no tracks, there's no like technical stuff. It's just like, hey, follow that, go. So it's fast. You can pick a frame range, and that's pretty great. And then the spaces can kind of be like, it's an extra feature on the rig. If it doesn't follow the head, you can make it follow the rig. Like you can give it an extra feature. I didn't show this. Actually, I didn't show this, but just trust me on this. I'll try to just puppet it with my camera here. But if you snap something, so say I have a keyframe A, so if I just do this, A, B, C, I have, this arc. If I take this little pointing pose and I want to arc down and go over here, and I have this keyframed and I have this keyframed, and whatever I did over here, let's just say I did it with the graph editor, the curve editor, right? So I have a keyframe here and a keyframe here, and this is just curve. If I use the snapping tool, depending on how you choose to use it, you do need to bake that whole section to get it working properly. Because if I only bake the first frame and the other frame, it's not going to know about that interpolation. So you do need to make sure you actually bake the range so it follows that curve. And that's true with most baking and stuff anyway. But anyway, that's not super important, so which is why it's not a demo. But spaces are single skeleton, and it's much more high maintenance just because if you make a change to your animation, you need to re-snap it, you need to rebake it, and that can go on for a while. So it's a little bit more high maintenance. So in general, if you have a very simple attach a thing, let go of it once, you can get by with an attach track if you want that stability. But if you want the flexibility of saying, oh, I want to be able to switch hands and give it to this other character and do this other thing, and then I want to throw it over here or whatever. If you want a more dynamic setup, constraints are usually where you want to go. You just have to, and you saw what I did just a second ago, like you can do a lot with it very quickly. That is easier, in my opinion, than setting up attach tracks to do the same thing. Because especially if it's trading ownership back and forth, that was pretty quick and easy. So that's the dynamic flexibility I was talking about. But ultimately, this is where I go to my last example here because I'm about at time. I have an example here. This you'll find in the file called attachments ready. There's some animation. And there are 3 options here with rifles. If you want to try this yourself, I recommend it. I recommend giving it a shot if you want to try the different options. We have one for attach track, parent constraint, and snapping. And I have a final version here, which is what I did. For all 3 have the exact same animation. They all work perfectly well. There's really no problem. The choice is yours. But attach track, the rifle itself is sitting here. The rifle is attached to the hand, and you can see the little attach track here. You can see it's attached to the hand. It follows the animation. And then all I did is I right click and I say trim and preserve. And then from there, I animate it falling to the ground and bouncing. Just manually keyframe the rifle. And that's that. Easy enough. The second option is a parent constraint. It's the same type of thing. The rifle, if I go to animation mode, you can see it. It has a parent constraint turned on until the point where I decide I don't want it anymore, in which case I just hit the little button and it turns off the constraint. And then I animate it falling to the ground. And I think I just copy pasted the animation from the first one. And then the last one has no constraint. It has no relationship. Sorry about the sirens again. I literally just said from frame 1 to frame 50 or something like that, copy. I just snapped to that spot, keep position and rotation, and that was right here with snapping. I just literally told it, children, parent, here to here, keep the offset, position, rotation, go, and it gives you the data. And then after that passes, I just animate it doing something else, and you can see its motion path through space as well. And so there's 3 different options that give you the exact same thing. It's just a matter of how you like to work, because again, there's no wrong way to do this. It's just what's the right choice for your shot and which one is going to give you the least amount of problems. The weapon drop is keyframed. I did not do physics. I typically don't do anything with physics for this kind of stuff. As a character animator, I want the control, even though I didn't really do a whole lot with it. But yeah, that is our course. And I hope you feel empowered.